Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of my LSM colleagues, welcome to the 6th annual Bach Workshop, the Cantata Workshop. Special guest to visitors who are with us today, as well as those who are joining on the live stream versus live from LSM, or from live at LSM. What we're going to do in the next little bit is talk a little bit about this word you might have heard a lot happening at LSM this year, cantata. Cantatas have been part of LSM since the very first LSM in 1982. For a long time, there were some solo cantatas sung as part of worship and recitals. And then in 1997, we got our first one with chorus. And then after that, it was part of evening prayer, actually, for a long time, until about 2006. So 20 seasons ago, we started singing cantatas as part of the third Sunday at LSM. So this is the 20th time we're going to do this. And so what we'll do today is talk a little bit about what is a cantata, why did Bach write so many of them, what sorts of things was he thinking about as he wrote them, and then kind of do a little kind of peek under the hood for this year's cantata and look at what's going on musically and some things to listen to. So. Well, and we'll do a little bit of rehearsing as well, because with Bach cantatas at LSM, there's some audience participation. So hopefully you all have one of these little bulletins or programs that's got the text of the cantata that you can look at, and then some music that we'll all sing together in preparation for tomorrow. So. Recently, cantatas at LSM have included some pretty long pieces. There was a cantata last year on the Ten Commandments in 2025. In 2024, we actually sang a cantata by Dietrich Buxtehude, who was a generation ahead of Bach, someone that Bach really admired, because in 2024 it was also the 300th anniversary of the St. John Passion. And so there was a performance of the Passion here at Lutheran Summer Music in conjunction with the Association of Lutheran Church Musicians, who will be joining us next week. So we'll get a chance to potentially hear the St. Matthew Passion on Wednesday night. That's open for you to attend. And then some other cantatas as well. It's sort of interesting to look, as we came out of the pandemic, we had a solo cantata, and then finally, when we could all sing together again, we had a cantata for trumpets and drums and all sorts of voices. And so you can see in LSM's archives all the different cantatas that have been sung. So it's a pretty strong tradition here at LSM. We also talk about the word, you may have heard of cantors at evening prayer. We talk about the cantata. Cantus was here last night, so this idea of cantare, that we're always singing together in community. That's part of what the cantata does here. It's a chance to really dive into this music of Bach, talk about Baroque music, things like that. Yeah, so a little bit of background about the cantata and Bach. Cantata, the word really comes from the early Baroque period. It really just meant to be distinguished from an instrumental piece. So in the early Baroque period, the early 1600s, composers started to write down titles of pieces that just said cantata, which just meant it was a sung piece, or a sonata, something that was sounded. So those of you who are brass players and play lots of Gabrielli, you've got canzona per sonare, so a canzona to be sounded. Early cantatas weren't always sacred. We're going to hear a cantata tomorrow in the context of the liturgy, the Lutheran liturgy, Lutheran Eucharist service. But early cantatas just meant a sung piece, and often they were secular, and often they were about love. Just like all the early operas, lots of early songs, a lot of them were about love. And there were different characteristics depending on where you lived. So Italian cantatas sounded a little bit different than French cantatas, which were different than English cantatas, German cantatas, etc. So I want to play a few of these for you just so you can kind of hear the stylistic changes. So first I'm going to play a little bit of an Italian cantata. It's just for a solo voice and some string instruments, and you hear lots of continuo. If you're listening closely to the bass line, you'll hear that the bass line repeats. It's actually a chaconne or a passacaglia. There's a repeating chord progression. And the text is really about love. It says, the poet writes, "I saw two bright stars fall from the sky. Love picked them up and placed them on my beloved's face." So looking into the eyes of the person you like. So not really Bach cantata church material here. Take a listen. So in that piece, it's really about the agility of the voice and what the voice can do, how it can ornament a line. It's really about featuring the singer. And that's about half of that cantata. There's another kind of repeat in the violin joins and plays kind of a counter melody. So very short pieces just meant to be sung. And in a lot of Italian cantatas, it was really about love and topics like that. French cantatas, kind of a few, maybe about 30, 40 years later, started to look at biblical topics. There were also, of course, cantatas about love, but we're going to hear next a cantata by Elisabeth Claude Jacquet de la Guerre, a French composer, and she sets the story of Jonah. So Jonah is told by God to go minister to people over there. Jonah gets in his boat, and what does he do? He goes the other way. Because he didn't want to do that. And there's a storm that comes up, and Jonah is swallowed by a big fish, okay? And he lives in the fish, and the fish finally, puts him back, lets him escape. So what we hear in this next cantata, again, it's just for solo voice, but you hear, because it's a story, you hear a lot more rapid text declamation. It will be in French, but you hear more rapid text. It's telling a story rather than just kind of talking about poetry and emotion. And so you'll hear a little bit of the setup to the scene, And then you'll hear the dialogue of Jonah being conflicted about doing or not doing what God tells him to do. And then you'll hear the instruments describe kind of Jonah setting out to sea and the tempest and storm. The storm. There's lots of turbulent movement in the bass. It's a very pleasant storm in major, but notice at the very bottom that this piece, if you can see, those of you who are close, it's about 17 minutes long, so it's quite longer than the Italian cantata we just heard. And you notice we're starting to hear different sections. There was kind of an instrumental interlude that we skipped over, and then a little narration, then a little section. Now there's an instrumental section. So the cantata is starting to get bigger as we go along. As we go further north into Germany and further along in the 1600s, what starts to happen is those different combinations of forces and movements, the addition of instruments, they start to make cantatas a lot longer. And we start to see distinctions between different styles of singing in cantatas. There would be sections that were just about plot, which now we call recitative. And then after the plot, we'd hear the emotional response, and we'd often hear that in an aria. Okay, and so the different instruments would show those sorts of things. I won't play one today, but we'll hear some later. So we hear different sections, and then as we got closer to Germany, Lutheran composers, as they started to take up cantatas, they would use existing source material. So they would use chorales and incorporate the texts and melodies of chorales into these larger and larger works that had more instrumental and vocal virtuosity. And so we get pieces like the next one, which is based on a Lutheran chorale called Nun lob mein Seel, which means my soul now bless your maker. Basically based on Psalm 103. And you'll hear all sorts of different sonic effects. You'll hear trumpets, you'll hear soloists against chorus, and this is kind of the model that Bach kind of is born into. He hears all of this sort of soundscape. Again, we're moving from this little Italian form to this large German form used in the context of a liturgy. Maybe. So that's kind of the soundscape that Bach came into as he started writing cantatas early in his career. We're going to hear right now from the conductor John Elliott Gardner to talk a little bit about that sort of history of the cantata and what Bach came into.
Originally, a cantata was a small, intimate Italian piece for a solo voice and a couple of instruments. But soon it was taken over by German composers in the century before Bach and was associated with the Lutheran liturgy. But by the time Bach came along, it had grown into something almost gargantuan. His 200 pieces last anything from 25 to 30 minutes each, occupied a place somewhere between the reading of the lesson and the sermon, and they reflected the theme of the day, as it were. You pity the unfortunate preacher who had to follow music as eloquent as this.
Siehe, siehe, ich stehe vor der Tür und klopfe an, so jemand meine Stimme hören wird und die Tür auftun, zu dem werde ich eingehen und das Abendmahl mit ihm halten und er mit mir.
So you notice that was the figure of Jesus speaking or singing and not talking about knocking at the door. And that's what the strings were doing, just sort of knocking gently at the door. So Bach is very pictorial in what he depicts. And tomorrow, the cantata will precede the sermon. So if you do see Chaplain Nathan today, make sure you give him a kind of, you can do it, you got it, since he has to follow all of that. You'll do fine, you always do. So that's what Bach is stepping into. Most of his cantatas were written when he was the cantor in Leipzig, Germany. He went there in May of 1723. He had some church positions before that, but that's where he spent the next 27 years of his life. He moved to Leipzig in 1723. And his main jobs were to teach, so there was a choir school associated with the Thomaskirche, or St. Thomas Church, and then he composed a lot of cantatas. He started writing cantatas basically for every Sunday, so he'd be working on looking at the text that was coming up, working with librettists to find what should we say or sing, thinking about what chorales to include, and then they'd have a rehearsal on Saturday, sing the cantata on Sunday, rinse and repeat for the next week. So it was very intense time for him. And so he wrote about, we think maybe somewhere around 300 cantatas in his first maybe 5 years there, but only about 200 have survived. The rest kind of got lost over time. He also tried to pattern these cantatas based on what would happen in the church year. So the readings that we hear on Sundays are all part of a large pattern called the liturgical year that starts in Advent with what we call the incarnation cycle. So you have the prophecies about Jesus' birth, and then the time of Epiphany, meaning manifestation, sort of the stories of Jesus' early ministry, and then we get into what we call the Paschal cycle, so Lent leading to Holy Week, to Easter, to Pentecost and Ascension, and now we are in a long stretch called Ordinary Time. So we're here in July, and on November 29th or 30th this year, we'll get back to Advent. So Bach wrote cantatas that reflected these themes throughout the year, as well as particular Sundays, and we'll talk about that in a moment. He was also responsible not only for music at the St. Thomas Church, which is there, but all four of the main city churches in Leipzig. It was kind of known as the city of churches. And so he had about 55 singers at his disposal, and he'd divide them into choirs. There would be one kind of the best singers, and they might do the cantata at St. Thomas Church one week, a different church the next week, and then a different group would go to a different church and just help sing the hymns. And so he had lots of assistants and was always complaining about there was always too much music, never enough time to rehearse. rehearse, never enough money, all of that stuff to hire instrumentalists. So there's never anything new under the sun. So you can still go to St. Thomas Church today. The choir school that Bach kind of ran and oversaw there dates back to the year 1284. So it was founded in 1284. And so by the time Bach actually started working there, it was a very venerable institution, very noteworthy, very famous post in Germany, and still is today. So again, the cantatas, he tried to get them to relate to the Sunday readings, whatever the gospel lesson was. And they were often heard before the sermon, or they were split around the sermon. So there would be a few movements, and then the sermon, and then the rest of the cantata. And again, he wrote several cycles of them early in his time. We have maps of the churches. We know who sat where, which family owned which pew. It's kind of interesting. And sort of the layout of another church. So a lot of people attended these. The services were probably close to 3 hours long and began at 7 a.m. So there'd be an hour of music and people arriving, and then the sermon was usually about an hour long, and then the rest of the service, the creed, communion, things like that, were about an hour. Then they'd leave, they'd come back at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock for Vespers. A lot of the patterns of the services are still pretty recognizable today, so this is probably hard for you to see in the back, but there's on one of his cantatas, when he was very new in Leipzig, Bach took the title page, and on the backside he wrote the order of the service, probably because he wasn't sure exactly what was coming up next. And we've found that, and we know that there was a prelude, there was a Kyrie, there was a gospel reading, a sermon, and then communion. So that some of the patterns we still experience here at LSM today, that we'll experience in tomorrow morning's service, if we were to travel back in time, we would probably recognize what was happening in one of Bach's services. If he were here with us today, he'd probably recognize what was going on. 1 second.
Bach had constantly to adjust his music to the talents and skills of his available musicians. But also, he had to lure in university students in exchange for private music lessons. There's something about Bach's orthography, his handwriting, which suggests already the gesture, the direction of a phrase. In some cases, Bach was forced to pay for extra musicians from his supplementary earnings, made from playing at weddings and funerals. At the end of each frantic week, Bach unveiled his latest cantata. What the Leipzig congregation made of these towering works, frustratingly, we simply don't know. All we do know is that plenty of people would have heard them. Leipzig was known as the city of churches. It's been estimated that on a normal Sunday, of a population of 30,000, 9,000 parishioners and members of society were crammed into these two churches, the Thomaskirche, the Nikolaikirche, and bulging from the seams of the other churches in the town. Thus, every week, Bach had an audience 10 or a dozen times bigger than in any opera house. Unfortunately, people at the main churches tended to behave as if they were in an opera house, much to the fury of the clergy.
The preachers very often think they don't listen carefully to the sermons, that's for sure. You get all kinds of complaints about people flirting in church, people sleeping in church, people throwing paper airplanes in church, and taking snuff in church.
And dogs coming into
dogs
church.
coming into church, absolutely. And some churches employ special dog whippers to try to get the dogs out. But I mean, earlier on you've had complaints about people taking pigs through church because it's the quickest way from where the pig was to market and so on. So I think our sense of proper behaviour in a church is different.
So there must have been a huge amount of noise, and one of the problems, that's one of the few things we really do know, is that people drifted in and out before the sermon, after the sermon, during the music. It must have been chaos. Everything was very, very stratified here socially, so the ladies were seated down here below, and the men were in the two galleries, both sides, and the hoi polloi were at the back with the riffraff. And the music, of course, came from the back of the church, up in the organ gallery. And it was raining down on the congregation but exactly at the moment when the ladies made their grand entrance. And given the fact this is Germany, there was a huge amount of social greetings, wie geht es Ihnen, gnädige Frau, that sort of thing, while the ladies took their seats and then gazed up adoringly at the preacher about to give his sermon. And the hubbub during Bach's music must have been excruciating. Poor man.
So we tend to think about performance these days in a lot of 19th century terms. That in the 19th century, that's when we started to get concert halls and silence between movements. A lot of the concert practices that we know today come from the 19th century, so well before Bach's time. And so in a way, we're very fortunate to be able to hear the music in kind of ways that aren't the same as in his time. But despite all of that, he was very committed to his craft, and one of the things that informed a lot of his cantata writing was his own personal theology. He owned a very large library, mostly of religious commentaries and biblical commentaries, and studied very carefully the writings of Martin Luther. One of the great treasures of the 20th century of research was that in 1934, Bach's Bible, one of his Bibles and commentaries, was found in a farmhouse in Michigan. And it was this particular commentary, and you see he marked his little book that he got it in 1733. There's his little J.S. Bach, 1733. And throughout the book, he's taken the commentary and biblical text. There's marginalia. He's underlined stuff. Sometimes he's even crossed things out that he knew were incorrect, kind of a misprint. So he was a very, very diligent student, a very, very interesting person, very cerebral, but also perhaps a little fun-loving. And just one more comment from John Eliot Gardner about Bach's persona here.
So striking to me, seeing it again, is the intensity of his gaze. I mean, those eyes. It's just extraordinary. They're so penetrative. I still feel there's a division between the upper half of his face and the bottom half. The upper half is so intense, it's got that beetle-browed, slightly myopic look. Below that, you see somebody quite different, somebody much more approachable, somebody who enjoyed the good things of life, a bon vivant who enjoyed his tobacco and his wine and his beer. And there's plenty of records of what he drank.
Yeah, there's actually, Bach would go around and he was known as an organist in his day, so he would go around and test or prove new organs that were built. And so they'd invite a bunch of musicians and organists, and there'd be kind of a multi-day celebration. And we have records of the meals that they served at those, and so we know a lot that Bach enjoyed his tobacco after a meal, as well as some brandy and beer as well. So, yeah, he ate a lot. But he's always, just like he ingested food and things at those organ-proving gatherings, he was always kind of reading, he was always studying, he liked collecting and copying music, because there weren't photocopiers, of course, so to learn a piece or to get your own copy, you often wrote it down and copied it. So we've got, he was just always taking things in, and you'll see often, both in tomorrow's bulletin and other things, we all of his cantatas, and most of his works have what we call a BWV number, the Bachwerkeverzeichnis, which just basically refers to the thematic catalog. And just for a little bit more trivia on Bach and symbolism, his name, B-A-C-H, can also be rendered musically. So in the German system, B actually refers to B flat, A, C, and the H is a B natural. So there, you can actually turn Bach's name into a musical theme. And he would play with clefs as well. So that little monogram on the right with the clefs going in a clock, B flat, A, C, H. The clefs help spell his name with the note in the center. And then you see his own personal monogram. There's a J, there's the S, And there's the B, and it's a mirror image of itself. So he liked games, he liked numbers and puzzles, and we see this kind of infused into his music as well. So that's a little bit about Bach and kind of the context he worked, who he was. And now just a little bit about this year's cantata, and I'd like to ask my colleague, Dr. Shannon Gravel, to come up a little bit and tell us how we got to this particular piece and all that.
Great, thank you. So, first of all, I have to say I'm really glad that Cantor Chad told you about cantatas are not just Bach, because I didn't know that until I went away to my master's and I started studying Barbara Strozzi and transcribing some of her music, and I was like, oh, yeah, okay, cantatas happen other places. All right, so 126, back in the fall, I was corresponding with Cantor Chad and Chaplain Nathan about cantatas, and the lectionary this year actually lined up with a different cantata, but we did that cantata 3 years ago. And so I don't want to do a repeat because I want to make it interesting for you. And so to be honest, I don't remember exactly how I landed on this one, other than I'm like, I think there's some similar words. But musically, let me tell you why musically, is because I was looking at the choral part. And I know that with the Bach cantata, I want to bring in student singers. And Bach is hard to sing stylistically. And so we have to really be intentional about how we approach it. And if it's too overwhelming, then all we're doing is trying to just learn notes without doing, with any concept of phrasing and articulation. And so this one, to me, seemed more accessible in that sense, except I apologize, basses, because those who are singing the bass part, you will hear in that opening movement that the vocal parts in general don't double the instrumental parts in that first movement. And the bass part literally carries the energy forward the entire time. They're kind of unfolding the Fortspannung, if you will. Okay, so there's kind of constant forward spinning on that. There's only 4 statements from the choir, and you'll hear the soprano melody, right? Can I talk quickly about language and the structure? Okay, I'm going to give you I want to talk a couple things about language. When I'm thinking about translations, I always kind of navigate, like, do I want to give you the flavor of what we're talking about, or do I want to, so like, for example, in one of the movements, there is a word, the Augenblick, and there is, it translates into an eye blink, or a blink of an eye. In the original translation, you're like, in an instant. I'm like, yeah, I mean, in an instant, but it really means in the blink of an eye. And to me, that's different. That has different intent. So I think about language in that way all the time. Like, how are we, you can use this word, the will of the people, but the power of the people, to me, has different intent. So when I think about translations and what we're trying to get at, those are the type of things I'm looking at the spirit of Bach and what I think, I don't know, I wasn't alive when he was, but like trying to figure out, like, channel Bach. Right. I think he was kind of a dramatic, I mean, with you music, you're like, dude, you have some like inner turmoil. Okay, so I'm going to give you some things to listen to for the entire movement so that when you get to church tomorrow morning and you have moments where you're like, oh, this is beautiful, and you're thinking about your spiritual practice and whatever you do during church, and if you have a moment where you want to listen to something in the music that's a little bit more academic or cerebral, I want to give that to you. So like I said, in the first movement, which is tutti, everyone is singing that first movement. You're going to hear the sopranos sing the chorale melody, the 4 statements. You're going to have the other parts kind of do this rapid succession of unfolding. And the instruments don't double those parts. So there's kind of cacophony, a wonderful cacophony of sound. You're going to hear the trumpet open up with this kind of ritornello, dum bum bum bum. Then you'll hear that come back in that first movement a bunch, and you'll hear this motive da 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 from the instrumentalist, and you'll hear that repeated over and over again. And you'll notice, because they're professionals, they don't go da da dun da da dun. They don't emphasize the strong beat, because that's not what you do. They kind of like energize going into it and then chill out. And then we go into the second movement, which will be this really, really wonderful reedy aria with Seth is Hartwell is certainly earning his money on this one, and you're gonna notice he's basically doing vocal gymnastics because it's pretty intense control and movement from his singing. The other thing I want to say is about this one is you're going to hear that he has this opening line is da 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 dun 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 da da. You hear this kind of da 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 da. You hear this descending line, and Cantor Chad talked about text painting in this kind of coming down from heaven. Yeah, so you're going to be listening to that in that second movement because that's really important. There's an A section, there's a B section, and there's a reprise of the A section, so you have that ternary form. And then you get to movement 3, and this is really phenomenal. This is just fascinating. So you have this kind of secco recitative between the alto, Dr. Phillips, and the tenor, Seth Hartwell, and it's a dry, it's a recitative, and all of a sudden it's not. Suddenly they're singing this chorale. You'll hear the chorale line, like a variation of the chorale line, either in the tenor or the alto voice, while the other line kind of duets with it. And then we go right back into this kind of secco recitative. And then we go back to this connected, like it's this back and forth kind of like true secco recitative, and then this duet. And it's really amazing. And at the very end, you're going to see there's this ascending line that's gleicht uns ins Leben aus dem Tod. And at the end, Seth will sing that line, and you're going to be like, oh, Dr. Gravel, is she trying to speed up the tempo? And I'm going to say yes, because we're talking about life, Leben. And then I'm going to slow down, because then we're talking about Tod. So like there's some of those choices, death. So we're making some of those choices as well musically, right? And then we get into Mr. Good's aria. This is a rage aria. It's in ternary form, so it's ABA. And you're going to, the continual part, dun, 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 dun. It's very, and the whole time you're going to be like, oh, we are feeling aggressively in our core, and that is appropriate. We're dashing to the ground, the pompous proud. So again, Bach kind of diving into this, and so please just enjoy that one. I feel like that one just kind of takes you along with it. And then we go back to recitative with our Seth Hartwell. And that's pretty short, and then we get into the chorale, and suddenly it's over, and we've just been on a very, very big emotional journey with this one. And then you'll find when we get to the chorale, it's not, the phrases aren't even necessarily. So in my score, there are fermatas, and we don't take fermatas in Bach like we might in modern parlance, because if we did that, everything would take twice as long. And so the fermatas really just indicate, like, take a breath. Right, you don't have that in the bulletin. You won't have that in the bulletin, but I have it in my score, and so I'll be kind of waving my arms to it, and you'll know, because you'll look up, and I'll do this little like conductory hitch in my gesture, and you'll be like, breathe. Okay, and then you'll notice that we're also going to be singing in English, and this is an intentional choice. We talked about, do we do German, do we do English, and I said, what would Bach do? Bach would have the language of the people. And so I thought we could have sung it in German, but unless you know how to translate German, I thought it would be maybe better for you to sing it in English, so we would have that. Should we sing it? All right, go ahead, open up. All right, good luck. Yeah, and we're just gonna start, we're just gonna go. Right at the corral.
In most cases, the chorales may have been sung by the choir, but we also know that pitch was a lot higher that day. Bach's choir was mostly young boys, up through age 18. And over time, over centuries, the rate at which our bodies change has actually, the age when that starts has decreased. So probably for Bach, he would have had 17 or 18-year-olds who were still sopranos. And that was not unusual for the time. And so that's sort of what we think of today as an English boy choir sound actually probably was quite prominent in a lot of Bach's music as well. As Dr. Gravel said, there's just lots of interesting symbolism in the cantata as well, where we're talking about things being hurled to the ground, and so we have these kind of quick dashes and rhetorical gestures in lots of different places. I just want to go back and say a little bit more about the piece itself and where it came from. Sorry, here we go. This is, the text actually comes from the 1540s, and what was happening at the time was the armies of what was then called the Ottoman Empire, so present-day Turkey, that sort of area, had invaded parts of Germany, and so there was a lot of fear about what was going to happen. And a particular pastor wrote a children's song, ein Kinderlied, Erhalt uns Herr, sustain us by your word. Sustain us, God, by your word. And here's, if you remember from Thursday morning prayer, where Cantor Paul talked about some text issues, the original said, from the Pope and Turks defend us, which we really don't want to sing that much anymore. So that was the original translation. To this was added a German version of a Latin plain chant that was done by Martin Luther himself. So, Verleih uns Friede, give us grace, God, we pray for good government and all of that. So the melody of that old plain chant sounded a little bit like this. And when Luther changed it to German, so we have a Latin plain song, he retained the contour of it, but had to change a few pitches. So we still have that contour. And then that became this melody, which we sang on Thursday, and that's kind of the main theme that is woven through the first movement of the chorale. We'll also hear it a couple other times in the service. So we're drawing on plain chant that is many, many centuries old, with a chorale text from 500 years ago that has been changed a little bit and brought forward and carried into our hymnals, and it's been used by other composers before Bach as well. And we hear also in some of the movements, you'll see in your translations, references to sort of bearing fruit, and that connects to the gospel for which this cantata was composed. It was from the Gospel of Luke, the parable of the sower and the seed. We're going to hear the same story tomorrow morning, but from Matthew's gospel. So this cantata is tying into the different lessons of the day, the lessons of the church, just as it did in Bach's time. If you are interested in some of this stuff, know that one of the great developments in the past, say, 20 or so years, is that a lot of Bach's music, the original copies, have been digitized. So you can be wherever you are, and if you want to look up all the information about this particular cantata, you can see the manuscripts of the original parts. So if you're like, why am I having to do that, or who wrote that down, you can actually go back to some of the parts, and they've even cataloged all the different scribes who actually probably copied the parts. This is a cantata for which we do not have Bach's original manuscript. And yeah, so a couple other little text things. Erhalt meaning sustain or keep. So at some points the choir sings the word erhalt and just holds it, literally sustains it underneath the chorale melody sung by the sopranos and the trumpet. We heard that the basses have kind of some difficult passages here at the idea of things forcefully being taken. So Bach, again, is being very dramatic and always ever thoughtful. Those are some things to listen to. We won't go into a whole detail about Baroque trumpets. Other than that, it's very hard to play because there were no valves. Everything had to be done via the embouchure for a Baroque trumpet player. So when Bach wrote very high and fast trumpet parts, his trumpet players got a little angry with him. And just one other tradition at LSM is we usually close the communion portion of the service with a little movement from a bonus cantata, which you see printed also in your little handout today. Come with us, O blessed Jesus. And I think we'll go ahead and close today by listening to a performance of that. You're welcome to hum along, find your part. Soprano, alto, tenor, or bass, count like crazy during what we call the ritornello, the little theme. It comes back, it returns, that's why we call it a ritornello. And we'll close tomorrow's service with this. So feel free to go ahead, stay seated, but find a part to hum along with or sing along with. I'll try to double your parts here. So hopefully through all that you have a little bit more background about what's going to happen tomorrow, where all that came from, why we do that here at LSM, and I think if you have any questions you can ask Dr. Gravel or myself, but otherwise I think it's time for lunch. So thanks all.